just like to say thank you to everybody on the panel this evening. It's been really interesting to hear some different aspects of equality law and challenge out with employment law. I was struck by what David said around the gentleman who was went in as an informal patient, and how that led to a recall. Because that, in my head, I know mental health is something that has been my area of expertise for a while in terms of policy and development, and that kind of was a non-compute for me. So I'd just like to ask where that's up to at the moment in terms of challenge.
Yeah, well, we've been refused permission on the papers. We're having to make a decision about whether we renew that application. So we potentially, within judicial review proceedings, you have to first put your papers in, convince a court that it's an arguable case. The judge considers it on the papers in the first instance. If the judge says doesn't consider it to be arguable, they can refuse permission. Then you then have the opportunity to renew that and argue it orally in court. So we are considering our position.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yep.
Thank you. Hugh Pritchard, Cardiff University. I was just wondering what role you would like law schools to play in this area, and what role should they play in either bringing attention to these cases or in early on educating students to be aware of these types of cases.
Is that something for me or no? I'm just going to come round so that I'm nearer the microphone. In terms of the Commission, certainly, for example, when I talked about that criminal justice inquiry, one of the potential recommendations we're looking at is, how lawyers understand the adjustments that are made for disabled defendants in that case, because that's the focus of that inquiry. But certainly, throughout the Commission's work, there's been discussion about both training for lawyers and judicial training, in fact, as well, to raise the profile of our issues. So tonight is one of our first events to try and encourage lawyers to talk about discrimination cases, but certainly we'd like to also encourage legal training. You'll be aware that the Commission on Justice report from October last year, so the Commission on Justice in Wales, suggested the Law Council for Wales, and we've been engaging with Welsh Government on those recommendations to try and ensure that discrimination and human rights issues are also a key focus in terms of all areas of training and raising that profile. Does anyone else want to add? I think. You want to add something? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and again, I'd like to thank the panel for a really informative session. Having brought a case as a litigant in person, which was a severely unpleasant experience, what are the panel's thoughts on the idea of, instead of civil litigation being brought at the county court, being brought at a Tier 1 tribunal, as employment discrimination cases are, to remove the threat of costs, especially when derisory Part 36 offers are made?
Yeah. I don't want to give myself more chance to talk, but the Commission actually supported a case only the week before last, which went to the Supreme Court. It was support a claimant called Leighton, and again I can send you the link to the case, but that related to cost shifting, and the Commission was supporting the position that discrimination claimants should be given the same sorts of protections from cost risk as are given in other areas. And certainly one of the Commission's priority aims is about access to justice and various different areas. I think in some ways we'd like to try and tonight is a good example, which we try and and other areas where we've undertaken inquiries, for example, in relation to legal aid, we'd like to give everyone access to the appropriate legal advice, probably in the first instance, but where people are accessing justice as litigants in person, also making sure that those reasonable adjustments and, if possible, reducing the cost risk. And again, as I was talking in terms of the Commission's work, we do provide funding for cases where legal aid isn't available, and we refer people to the Equality Advisory Support Service, which supports people who are representing themselves with advice.
Yeah. I was also particularly thinking of the tribunal being less formal than a court, less intimidating. So obviously litigants in person with disabilities already have a disadvantage in presenting themselves anyway, so...
Yeah, I can't say too much, but the criminal justice inquiry in particular, which is obviously focused on the criminal justice process as opposed to the wider justice, but a number of those consider reasonable adjustments that are required for people, as I mentioned, with those specific conditions. But there are parallels in civil justice and other areas, certainly. And I know that the equal treatment bench book includes an awful lot of provision for judges to take that into account.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that is a handbook which is updated regularly, and I can only speak from civil justice point of view, but we do have to and want to obviously make reasonable adjustments for people with certain requirements, and we often do in terms of, for example, hearing impairment, or I remember doing one case where we had someone to write out the evidence as it happened on a screen so that the person could follow what was being said, and took regular breaks so that that person could check what was being said. There were also heating issues and light issues, and we do have the facility, as long as we're given plenty of notice, that's very important, to make reasonable adjustments, which is what it's all about. I mean, coming back to Hugh's point, I do think there's a real need, and this is shown by some of the examples given tonight, of much more awareness on the part not just of lawyers, but of general providers of services, landlords, as I say, someone who's got a newspaper shop. And we find very helpful the personal support unit, as it used to be called. It's now called something else.
Support through court.
Support through court, thank you. And they are volunteers. They can't give legal advice and they can't represent. What they can do is make that initially intimidating atmosphere, and we do understand that it can be intimidating, much less intimidating for litigants in person, and that is absolutely invaluable. So yes, anything universities can do to make students more aware and the general public, nothing can be, well, nothing is harmful to making people more aware. This is very, very important this evening, though I think is the first step of many, I hope, in Wales. And I'd like to associate my remarks with the others about welcoming Anne Hallett here. Well done.
Thank you. Anything else? Yeah. Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Diolch. My name is Crash. I'm a student at the Cardiff Law School, but before that I also worked for Stonewall Cymru, the LGBT rights charity. And I wanted to ask a question about the advice deserts aspect of this and how people can gain access to legal advice. So my question is, especially thinking about the work we did at Stonewall, when people have experienced discrimination, often their first point of call might be to get advice from charities like us, or even smaller charities, community groups even, and very local groups with not very much legal knowledge. And I was just interested to know, what would your main suggestion be to someone who should get legal advice as to where to seek it if they've been discriminated against, especially in areas outside of employment?
I think a key issue which was touched upon has been the demise of legal aid, because most people are terrified that as soon as they walk into a solicitor's office they're going to get a massive bill. Okay, and so I think there's a challenge for the solicitor's profession to break down barriers, not have the kind of formal, too over stuffy offices and the like, But I also think the challenge is I mean, you know, most of the work I do in these kind of areas of law, we do on legal aid, and because we're acting for vulnerable people who often are, therefore, people who are eligible for legal aid. Or as we've now been told, you can get support for cases from the Commission. So really is trying to make sure that people know that there are lawyers out there. Again, the whole purpose of today. There's lawyers, there's solicitors, barristers, there's the Commission who are there. The trouble is there's not many of them actually, and particularly in Wales, they're very limited, but they are here. And you know, don't be afraid of approaching a solicitor who's got experience in that area of law, because they will not be hitting you with a big bill, because they would never have any work if they did that to people. It really is, and we know how to you know, use the legal aid system to actually work for people, and that's what I would say. Don't be afraid of solicitors, but I think there's a challenge for the solicitors profession to make itself more user-friendly and get rid of that still fuddy-duddy image, which I'm afraid some of my colleagues perpetuate.
But just on that point, I think my colleague has some leaflets to hand out to you when you're leaving. The Commission runs an advice to advisors line, and also we run training courses for advisors to try and identify discrimination. So as Michael said, we would hope that people get referred on for the appropriate legal advice, and our legal aid inquiry is all about trying to break down barriers for people accessing that advice and support for solicitors, but we also target advisors so that they hopefully identify and refer people on in the appropriate way as well. And the number for that advice line is on the leaflet sheet. The other Angharad that works for the Commission is giving out today.
Where there's no legal aid, and I agree that's a very worrying development in terms of access to justice. There are, apart from the Commission, other agencies or advice centres, pro bono units, Network Wales that gives advice. So there are a plethora of different agencies, but sometimes it's just difficult to know which one to go to. And of course, although those may be present in the larger cities, Cardiff, Swansea, in Mid Wales and areas of North Wales, they probably wouldn't be so accessible.
There's also Welsh Government are trying to push out funding in this area. So Citizens Advice have a new discrimination advice project which relates to wider than employment advice. And so some of the areas where there isn't necessarily legal aid, there is alternative advice services. And Speakeasy Advice Centre in Cardiff was awarded Law Centre status last year. So there are, as you say, a way extending, although, you know, we'd still suggest you try and seek legal advice and you know, legal aid in those ways. Those other services are supposed to plug the gaps in many ways.
Can I just, the Law Centre Advice Network is particularly good. I don't take away from anything that's been said. We need solicitors dealing with this work. We hopefully we have to get the legal aid to be able to do it. But I've done a number of pro bono advices and assistance for law centres, and their network is particularly good. I mean, they're even able to say, we've got a case going on a little bit like this and they'll direct you to somewhere else, then you can speak to somebody else. And so I've had conversations with counsel, both of us working pro bono, working on very similar issues because of their network, and it's really rather good.
Yeah.
Just a question at the back of the room. Oh, sorry, Rachel. Sorry.
I'm 5'2". I'm never going to.
Sorry.
I should have just got up. In housing, obviously, there's the housing duty solicitor scheme at court, but your access to that does depend on your case being listed on a day. The other issue with housing is injunctions. And I was at a court in South Wales recently where the district judge, if he had had any hair, would have been tearing it out, because he said none of the local firms will touch an injunction case because they don't have a legal aid contract. And he had specifically adjourned this case several times for the particular tenant to get advice, because he was so concerned that this lady didn't get advice. So although there is the desert, there is this growing awareness by judges, which I think someone commented on earlier, that really pushing people to go and get advice. But it is concerning when your case isn't listed on the duty housing day, you're a bit stuck. And of course the potential consequences are you lose your home.
Hi, I'm Emma and I work at Owen Mitchell, but I'm also sitting on the National Committee for the Young Legal Aid Lawyers. Something that we're really concerned about at the moment is the introduction of the super exam. And in terms of the syllabus that's been sort of put forward for the super exam, has effectively just taken out all of the sort of social justice areas and modules, and what I was sort of interested to know was just people's views on how we can kind of get more practitioners into this area of law if, you know, we're not sort of teaching it at the university. But yeah, I'm just interested to hear about that.
I don't know if you want to answer that. Maybe I should answer it. There are, you know, similar to what we're talking about this evening, certain oases within that same difficulty. You might be aware of the Justice Fellowships from the Legal Education Trust, which are pushing forward, you know, work in terms of social welfare, and the Commission is obviously working to encourage discrimination and human rights advice. But you're right, the exam doesn't necessarily cover everything. And I think one of the other things is that I spoke last year at Cardiff University on to their law students about options just in terms of being employed as a barrister instead of being self-employed. I think there's a job really for us as practitioners to get the message out about what type of work is there, because I think one of the reasons legal education might be narrow and the exam, as you've talked about, is because people don't see practice. And one of the things we were keen to do this evening was to show how in almost any area of law you work in, discrimination and human rights can have an impact, and we do still need to do some work in terms of getting that message across. You know, if you're on that committee and willing to work with us, we'd be happy to support you with it.
Can I say that I think that you know, human rights law, public law, particularly in Wales, I think it should be a growing area, because it should be what Carwyn Jones called the devolution dividend. Things are different. And I thought, well, I deliberately thought that this should be a growth area, which is one of the reasons I started doing more and more of it, and the work just started to follow us, particularly in education and health, which are wholly devolved. So I'm amazed that there aren't more people pushing this, more competition for me, more good barristers out there, particularly in Wales. So it is, I find it odd, and I think it would be it should be something which young barristers and young lawyers are thinking, yeah, I should get into that, because A, it's quite interesting stuff, and B, it's worthy stuff, and C, I think it should be a growth area, particularly in Wales. So really, I think it's the way forward, really, and we should be selling it like that.
Well, those were exactly the reason why administrative court cases have been a growth area in Wales, and I think the gap in representation, which Dr. Sarah Nason identified, is probably still there to some extent, but to a much smaller extent, and that's why I hope and expect that this area that we're talking about now will take a similar pattern. And as Lady Hale said, in the case I quoted, there is this tendency to think, well, it's just European Convention and human rights thing all over again in housing. And it's not, it's very, very different, and the two must be seen as different.
I suppose the other thing to say is, if we can identify there's a problem in not getting students interested in public law, the thing we have to do is go and address that at source. So if we're not having those exams, we need organisations going into universities, I suppose, and saying, okay, this is an available option for you. I mean, I know Public Law Wales, for example, are making a lot of progress in doing that type of thing. We used to do just simply practitioner-based events. Now we tend to mix it up a little bit now. So we've had actually a joint event with YLL last year in Cardiff Uni. Only last week we had a similar event in Swansea University, and it's about going in and making sure people are aware. Listen, if you want millions of pounds, you're not in the right game. But if you want to make a difference in life, this is the way to do it, and make people aware that that is an option. So I say, organisations such as this, or Public Law Wales, YLL, need to be into the universities.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Good evening. I'm the Yvonne Harrod from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. At the Commission, we're doing a piece of work at the moment looking at increasing the availability and quality of equality and human rights advice in Wales. obviously you're all very experienced in this area, and my question really would be around, from experience, what particular areas of law should we be focusing our efforts on? And any particular gaps that you see in terms of the delivery of discrimination advice?
I mean, from judicial review perspective, it's widespread. I picked prisons simply because I thought it was a particular topic I've had very recent experience in, but it's across the board. You don't really see it pleaded, and that's why I was really keen on being involved tonight. So, I mean, if you are a practitioner who's dealing with education cases, there's a gap there. It's not really being pleaded that often in terms of judicial review. I mean, if you are dealing with prisons cases, as I say, if you're dealing with, well, I'm not going to go through a list, that's silly. But my point is, I see it so infrequently pleaded that I think it must be a widespread and across the sectors gap. So whichever area you're in, I think, have a look at it, because if you want to make substantive change to local authority policy, to Welsh Government policy, to UK Government policy, judicial review, in my view, is how you go about doing it. It's quite broad, I'm afraid, but I think the problem is quite broad. Those who work in housing, they may have more specific suggestions, I don't know.
Certainly in respect of housing, I think, and it may be because both myself and Rachel both deal with social housing, these issues are, I think, now more frequently being raised, but they're certainly, I, for example, came into it almost by accident, where I happened to have a client like Mr. Smith, and legal research led me on to then start looking at, well, what does that mean for that? And then we pleaded the Equality Act in that case. Again, generally speaking, from my experience in respect of housing, because it's closely regulated in terms of who has a legal aid contract and who can help housing clients, they tend to be the same sorts of solicitors who are involved, so they are being, generally, these issues are being litigated where they're supposed to be. But certainly that, like I said, that was sort of something that came about, certainly from my perspective, because I stumbled upon it in research, and it tends to be the same sort of people involved in these cases. But, you know, there was nothing I could point to, and even now in terms of a wider basis as a professional, and being a self-employed barrister, other than, for example, this sort of event, there isn't very much to point you towards discrimination and human rights issues, and to keep an eye on it in your practice generally. And it should be something, I think, I have a practice that looks at areas other than housing, and it's certainly something I now do, where I consider these sorts of issues in other cases and if they arise. But I think generally there needs to be sort of just more awareness within the profession completely. And I think a lot of junior barristers now will have mixed practices, certainly at the beginning of their career. And so just sort of plugging that generally may mean that it falls into different areas too.
I think this is one area where, as Mike said, Wales has a particular opportunity here. We've heard a lot about social landlords, but of course private landlords also have this duty. And in Wales, landlords now have to be registered, and registered landlords have to go through training programs. And this is a sort of excellent candidate for making sure that that's part of the training program and very clearly set out. But as I said, things like services and goods as well, the provision of service and goods, shops, and I'm sure if you go around most private shops in this area, very few shopkeepers would understand their duties.
I would look at the care and support issues and needs, and particularly Social Services and Wellbeing Act in Wales. I think the surface of that has hardly been scratched in terms of the law surrounding that. There's not that many cases that come out of that act, but it's a huge, all-encompassing act about how people with disabilities and vulnerabilities are supported by local authorities and the like. So I think that's a big area which is still not being fully put under the microscope yet.
Anybody else? I thought I saw a hand going up. No? Does anyone have any other questions? No. Well, I guess it sort of falls on me then to thank our speakers this evening, and perhaps to just offer another round of applause to everyone that's spoken.